Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you've not been here before, this is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel, and I am Holly, and every week I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 4. Now, firstly, a really quick shout out and thank you to my sister Eden. Hey girl, hey, and thanks. I had so many ideas for the cases that I wanted to cover running around this head, and she really helped me piece together which ones I would do first and which ones should wait a little bit. So thank you, girl, because I was a little bit of a mess. Now, today we're going to be discussing Samantha Bodsworth and the almost perfect murder. Now, I say almost perfect because the killer literally would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for a branch of forensic science that had never before been used in Australia. In fact, it had only been used a handful of times worldwide, but it helped put someone behind bars and bring a killer to justice. So, let's just jump into it. Just before 8 a.m. on Saturday the 31st of August 1996, a couple who were holidaying in Noosa decided to go on an early morning walk. They were walking through the Noosa National Parklands when they came across something they never expected to find. And it wasn't a mannequin, because it is never a mannequin. It was a body. It was female and was dressed in red pants and a black shirt. It was lying face down in the scrub off the side of the walking track. It was in dense vegetation and it was hidden from the open parking area that led into the national park, which was also only a few hundred meters from a busy tourist beach. They immediately contacted the local police department and reported their gruesome discovery. Police arrived and within a few hours had recovered the woman's body from within the wattle trees. They noticed the body was covered in bruising over her neck, cheeks, and eyes, and there were ligature marks around her neck. She had been badly beaten and strangled. Forensics determined from the crime scene that the body couldn't have been there much longer than a few hours before it had been found, and detectives were questioning whether this was a tourist, a holidaymaker visiting Noosa, or if it was a local resident. Noosa is one of the most popular holiday destinations in Australia. It's warm most of the year round, and it's surrounded by beautiful natural hinterland on the west and more than 10 pristine beaches to choose from along the east coast. 30 minutes from the main city centre of the Sunshine Coast and only 2 hours from Brisbane, it attracts over 2 million international visitors each year on average, which is huge considering the town's population is only just over 55,000. The detectives and forensic units then began the painstaking task of collecting evidence from the scene. The woman's hands were bagged to ensure that anything that fell from her hands or under her nails could be examined at autopsy, and fibres were collected from her body and clothing using tape lifts. Footprints found around the body and leading to and from it were moulded, and this was no easy task. The Noosa Parklands is situated just out from the beach, and so most of the impressions had been made in sand, which means the process was agonizingly slow to actually take the moulds. They had to be meticulous, making sure that nothing was disturbed and the moulds could actually be taken before a gust of wind came along to destroy any of the evidence. Forensics collected soil and plant matter from around the area, hoping that they might be able to match grains of sand or dirt to a suspect at some point in the future. They had listed the time of death at around 6 to 7 p.m. the previous evening. The main priority now that the evidence had been collected was to identify this woman. She had been found with no identification on her, but she did have some distinctive tattoos and a large number of ear piercings. 2 of the tattoos were comprised of birds carrying scrolls that actually contained the names Michael and Corey. The Michael and Corey tattoos stood out to police, and they knew that these would be important evidence in identifying this mystery woman. So they released the discovery of the body and the details of identifying features to the media. The news report that same day stated that the woman was in her mid to late 20s, had shoulder-length brown hair, was wearing a red pair of jeans and a dark top, and had a number of earrings in each ear. They also reported that the deceased had a number of tattoos, including the ones that had the names Michael and Corey, and that she was wearing a distinctive S-shaped silver ring. On that same morning, in a town called Gympie, an hour north of Noosa, Malcolm and Lynn Hall were worried. Every Friday they rang their daughter Samantha Bodsworth to catch up on what had been happening in each other's lives that week, to share stories and to see how their grandsons were doing. But the night before, Sam hadn't answered. It was strange. They'd been doing this for years. Sam was always there on the Friday to take their call. It was tradition. It was a ritual. They were a close family, and even if they couldn't always see each other, they had their Friday evening call. Malcolm and Lynn were concerned, but maybe Sam had decided to go out for the night, or maybe she was in the shower. She'd call back. But this time, she never did. That Saturday morning they got a call from a friend in town, and Malcolm shared his concerns for his daughter. The friend said that they would let Malcolm and Lynn know if Sam showed up at the local pub where she worked, and told them not to worry. But later that day, Malcolm received another call from a friend who lived a couple of hours away in Brisbane. This friend asked Malcolm and Lynn if they'd seen Sam lately. When Malcolm and Lynn confirmed that they hadn't, the friend then told them about the news report that he'd seen earlier that morning. "Well," he said, "it's just been on the news that the police have found a body at Noosa in the park, and she's got the boys' names, Michael and Corey, on her arm, and there wouldn't be many of those about." Lynn and Malcolm's hearts both sank. There wouldn't be that many people around that would have the names of their two grandchildren tattooed on the same place on their body. They both hoped and prayed that it wasn't Samantha, but in their minds they knew that there was a good chance that it was. They immediately rang the Noosa police station, asking about the body that had been found in the Parklands, telling police that they believed it could be their daughter, Samantha Bodsworth. Samantha was 29 years old and worked in the local Gympie pub, the Mount Pleasant Hotel, to support her two children. And she was also passionate about local charity work. She lived to help others. She was kind and loving, and she was a caring and supportive friend and mother. Samantha had been supposed to meet her boyfriend on that Friday night for drinks. She'd finished her shift, gone to drop the boys at her ex's parents' house, was going home to shower, change, and have her Friday evening call with her parents, and then was going to meet her boyfriend back at the bar, but she never showed up. They gave a description of their daughter and a full description of all of the tattoos that Sam had, including a red rose that had the word Mum, a small planet and cherub, and a bird with the word Dad, and the Michael and Corey tattoos. The investigators asked if Lynn and Malcolm would go to Brisbane to look at and possibly identify the body. Lynn said that even though they asked it, it almost seemed like a formality, that the police knew once they'd given them Samantha's description that it was her. But because formal identification had not yet been made, they needed the pair to come to the Brisbane morgue. When Lynn saw the bruised, beaten body of her 29-year-old daughter in the morgue, she broke down. The only thing she wanted to do was hug her baby girl, somehow to warm her up because it was so cold in the morgue. Lynn said, though, that the one thing she noticed above anything else was that Sam didn't have any makeup on. Now that seems like a trivial thing, but Samantha had been involved in a car accident a few years back and had caused a scar on her face, and she'd always been severely self-conscious about it. She would put a full face of makeup on, even just to run down to the shops to pick up milk or bread. So if she'd gone out on that Friday night, she would definitely have put makeup on. This was the strangest thing to Lynn. She said there was no way on this planet that Samantha would have gone anywhere without makeup on, even just to answer the front door. So why was Sam found an hour's drive away from home, dressed to go out with no makeup on? The police had some theories, the best being that she'd gone to Noosa for a night out and perhaps she'd met someone in a local club and something had gone wrong, that she had been murdered by a one-night stand. But it still didn't explain the makeup. Her mother also said that just would have been really unlike her. She preferred to stay close to home with her loved ones, especially her sons, Michael and Corey, who had been staying with their paternal grandparents, their father's parents, that night. The police decided that their next step needed to be to search Samantha's home, where she lived with her two boys. When they got to the residence, they entered through the garage door, and they noticed a few spots of blood leading from the garage into the main house. They also noticed some blood stains in the bedroom and some partially cleaned blood marks in the lounge and dining rooms. The police knew that the instinct reaction in a murder is to try and clean up the scene, and it looked as though someone had tried, albeit not very well, to wipe up some of the blood that was in the house. They collected samples of the blood to try and see if anyone other than Samantha's blood could be identified at the scene. It seemed like there had been a struggle by the marks and bruising on Samantha's body and by the state of Samantha's bedroom. So whoever had done this to her may have left some of their own blood or other evidence if the house was indeed the place that she had been killed. Investigators also found a hairdryer in Sam's bathroom that had small bloodstains on the cord, and this was thought to have been the weapon used to strangle Samantha Bodsworth. The laundry was also searched, and when the investigators looked inside the washing machine, they found a few items of clothing still wet. They pulled out the female clothing and found bloodstains on the items that hadn't properly been washed out. They also found a pendant from a necklace. When Lynn and Malcolm were asked about the necklace, Lynn confirmed that Sam had been given the piece of jewellery from an uncle in Britain, and it was one of Samantha's most cherished possessions. You couldn't get the stone that was on the pendant from anywhere other than the small shop in Britain where it had been purchased, so it couldn't have been confused for any other piece of jewellery. Lynn and Malcolm also confirmed that Samantha had not once removed the necklace since the day she'd been given it, not even to shower or when she went swimming. So why on earth would it have been put through the wash, and where was the chain that went with it? Although there didn't seem to be any forced entry into her home through the front or garage doors, one of the screens from a window near the front door had been removed, and Samantha's car was missing. It wasn't in the garage where it should have been, and it wasn't anywhere around the Noosa Parklands parking area where she'd been found. The investigation was very quickly raising far more questions than it was answering. The two crime scenes were over an hour's drive away from each other, and her car was nowhere to be found. So how did she get to Noosa? Was she alive when she got there? Was she killed in her home and taken to the spot where her body was found? Did she go to Noosa of her own free will, or was she forced? These were all questions that detectives needed answers to, but the case would only become more bizarre. The post-mortem on the body had confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation, but the injuries that Sam sustained had drawn blood, and there was no blood evident at all on any of the clothing that she was wearing, and there should have been. This pointed to investigators that someone had changed Samantha's clothes after they had killed her. Investigators decided that the most likely crime scene was actually her house. The blood-stained clothing in the washing machine, the change of clothes she'd been found in, the blood marks in the numerous rooms of the house, all pointed to Sam having been murdered in her own home. But how she had gone from her home in Gympie to a sandy beach walking track in Noosa was, at that point, anyone's guess. On the day Samantha's body had been found and the subsequent news report, A man named Michael had walked into the Gympie police station. When asked why he was there, he said that he'd seen the news report about the woman's body that was found in Noosa, and that he'd come down to the station to see if it was his ex-de facto wife, Samantha Bodsworth. He had seen the story that mentioned Michael and Corey's names, his sons' names, and he was pretty sure it was her. Michael Bodsworth was taken into an interview room to talk with detectives to see if there was anything that he knew that might help them in the investigation. Michael told detectives that he'd been in a relationship with Samantha for about 11 years, and then denied that the two were still together. When asked what had happened to the relationship, he mentioned that he'd been abusing alcohol and that they argued a lot, and eventually she'd kicked him out about 4 months prior. He went to live in a small room above the local pub, the Mount Pleasant Hotel. Samantha's parents give a very less sanitized version. Lynn, in an interview, said that Michael liked to threaten to kill Samantha if she was doing something that he didn't like. She would retort back with, "Well, I guess the boys won't have a mum," and then Michael would respond with, "Well, that won't matter, 'cause I'll kill them and myself, and then we can all be a happy family again." Malcolm stated that they knew Michael was physically abusing Sam during their relationship. They weren't exactly sure to what extent, but Sam finally got sick of it and threw Michael out once and for all. The investigators knew the statistics. In Australia and around the world, when a woman is murdered, the most likely suspect is the current or ex-partner. Now, that's not to say it's always the husband, wife, or partner of the woman, but in Australia, it's around 64% of femicides. A study done in 2019 also showed that violence can either begin or get much worse when there's been a period of separation. For example, a breakup. Detectives kept this in mind when Michael Bodsworth openly walked into the station to discuss his ex-partner's suspected murder. The line of questioning went to the last time that Michael had actually seen Samantha. He said it was the afternoon before, on Friday the 30th of August at about 5 p.m. at the Mount Pleasant Hotel. They'd been standing at the bottom of the stairs in the doorway talking, and she had told him that she had dropped off Michael and Corey at his parents' house. He asked her if he could possibly have a shower at her place, which was far nicer than the hotel amenities, and besides, the pub's hot water system had blown out about a week before, and he was not looking forward to a cold shower. She said, yeah, that would be okay. He ran back upstairs to his room, threw some clothes in a bag, and then he went over to his mum and dad's place to visit the boys. He said he left his mum and dad's house at about 6:30, and then he offered that he then went to the local grocery store after that. He needed to pick up some smokes. He told the detectives he bought 2 packs of Long Beach cigarettes, and then he left the store. The police also asked him if he got a receipt. He said yes. They asked him if he had it with him, and he said no, it's back in his room. The detectives asked Michael if he knew about what time he'd bought the smokes. Michael said it was 1844. Like, he had actually memorized the 24-hour time on the receipt he got from Woolworths. Detectives were pretty surprised at this. They asked him how he knew the exact time, and he said he'd read it on the docket. He said he always checks the dockets. They asked him if he always checks the time on receipts, and he said yeah, he does. That's how he told the time. He didn't wear a watch, so he just used receipts. He'd gotten back into his car to head to Sam's for the shower, but his car wouldn't start, so he rang Samantha. They asked what was wrong with his car, and he said, quote, "Me battery terminals are a bit dicky." And then he said that Sam said she'd come and get him. He said that she had rung him back fairly quickly. She had walked out of the house and forgotten her keys, and she'd locked herself out. He told her that she'd have to try and break back into her house somehow. And that was the last time that Michael had spoken to or heard from Samantha Bodsworth. He waited for a little while for her, but then just decided to try and get to her place on foot, so he started walking. When he got to Sam's house, her car was gone, all the lights were off, and he started knocking, but no one answered. She was gone. So Michael Bodsworth just walked all the way back to his car, where miraculously it starts. He drove back to the Mount Pleasant Hotel, had a cold shower there, changed his clothes, and went downstairs to drink at the bar. Michael Bodsworth had given police a minutely detailed account of every exact movement he'd made in the last 24 hours since he'd spoken to Samantha. Now, usually when someone tries to recall everything they've done in a day, they'll get a couple of things mixed up or not recall exact times. But Michael knew exactly where he was for every second of the day. This seemed slightly suspicious and fishy to police, so they asked Michael if he would consent to them searching his room at the hotel and collecting the clothing that he'd been wearing the day before. He said that was fine, so the police escorted him back to the pub. When the police and Michael got to the hotel, there were a lot of people there, and they all knew Samantha. She was a local and she was well loved. One of the men in the pub that night was Scott Knowles, Samantha's current boyfriend. They'd started seeing each other a couple of months after Sam and Michael had split up. Most of the locals knew about Michael and Sam's turbulent and often violent relationship, so they had all formed their own opinions about who had killed her, and they all thought it was Michael. The police had to take Michael straight upstairs. The guys in the hotel were riled up, and Scott was actually being physically held back by a few of the boys. He was emotional and he was angry, and he was sure that Michael had killed his girlfriend. In the police interview with Michael, they had actually asked him if he felt any jealousy about Sam seeing Scott so soon after they'd separated. Michael said no, not at all, because Sam told him that they weren't actually sleeping together or having sex, and he believed her. He was then asked how he would feel if they were sleeping together, if Scotty would have, for example, moved into the house that Samantha shared with the boys, and Michael said that would be fine, he could move in if he wanted, no problem. They asked him if Scott had ever been physical or hit Samantha, and Michael said no, absolutely not. Scotty didn't have a violent bone in his body. Michael seemed to like Scott a whole lot more than Scott liked Michael. When the officers and Michael got to his room, they examined the room, and Michael gave them the clothes that he said he was wearing the last time he saw and spoke to Samantha. They'd been freshly washed and were hanging on a line outside his room. Now, Michael didn't at all seem concerned that the police were taking some of his possessions for evidence or collecting his clothing. It did seem like all he was trying to do was assist in the investigation in any way that he could. After searching his room at the pub, police escorted Michael to his parents' house to try to keep him out of harm's way of the literal lynch mob that had formed at the bar. At this point in the investigation, police knew who Samantha was, and they had two prime suspects in her murder. One was Scott Knowles, her current boyfriend, and the other was Michael Bodsworth, her ex-de facto husband. Michael Bodsworth, though, was the focus of the investigation, for a few reasons, but one particular thing that had been uncovered in his police interview were fresh cuts and scratches on his hands. He told police that he'd got them at work at exactly 12 noon on Friday, the last day that he'd seen Samantha. They then asked if he would voluntarily supply blood for the purposes of DNA comparison. He said no. He didn't like needles very much, so they asked if he'd give a saliva sample, to which he agreed. The detectives sent his saliva sample for comparison, and they were also still waiting on the results from the scrapings from underneath Samantha's fingernails. The next step was to examine Samantha's car. That same day, it had been found by a local in the back parking lot of a Gympie nightclub. On the driver's seat and in the driver's seat well were a few bits of leafy matter and bark, and lodged in the license plate in the back of the car was a large clump of pollen that looked very similar to the wattle trees that Samantha had been found near. These, along with other items like the cigarette butts from the ashtray, were bagged as evidence. The cigarette butts were the same brand that Samantha was reported to have smoked, and they also happened to be the exact same brand that Michael had purchased the night she was last seen. At Michael's police interview, he had said to police that he had been in Sam's car before, always in the passenger seat, but he'd never driven it. He'd never even so much as sat in the driver's seat. But he also handed over a set of keys that belonged to Samantha that he had mysteriously found in his room at the hotel. He said that Sam must have left him there on the Friday night, but he noted that her car key was not with them. It was missing from the keyring. The detectives questioned why Samantha would have left her keys in his room, and Michael said, "Well, I don't understand it either, but there's no car key, and another key is missing too." He confirmed that he didn't have his own set of personal keys to her house, but that she had a key to his room, so she may have gone to his room at some point and left her keys behind. He had given her a key to his room because even though they had split up, she was still doing domestic duties for him. She would come through and clean his room up. She would collect his washing or ask him to bring it around to her place, and she would wash all of his clothes every week, saving Michael from having to pay to use the hotel's washing machines. Even though she didn't want to be with him, she still cared for the guy and wanted to make his life a little easier after kicking him out of her house. He was the father of her children, and she wanted to set a good example for her boys. On Sunday the 1st of September, the police issued a media statement asking for anyone that may have seen her car on Friday the 30th of August to come forward. Because of the vegetation found in and on her vehicle, they suspected that whoever had killed her had driven her car to that spot, and they were desperately hoping that someone may have seen the white Corolla wagon as it had made the hour-long trek to the holiday destination. That evening, the police had set up a major incident caravan at the car park of the Noosa Parklands, hoping that one of the local Noosa residents might come in to give them the information that they needed. They had received a couple of reports from people around Gympie that they'd seen a car similar to Samantha's driving around at about 7:30 that night, with a man driving and a woman wearing a hat in the passenger seat, but no one could confirm with any certainty that it was Samantha's car, and the forensic analysis of her body had listed her time of death at about an hour before that. A local truck driver in the Noosa area, known as Mr. Higgins, came to the incident caravan that night. He had been working on the Friday afternoon and evening, driving trucks, and he had come up behind a white Corolla matching the description of Samantha's car. He remembered this because it was driving so slowly. He managed to overtake the vehicle, which is unusual. It's usually the cars that overtake the trucks. But he got to the next hill along the road and the white car passed him, so he was again stuck behind this slow-moving wagon. Now this made him really take notice. He noted the registration number of this slow vehicle and was able to confirm with certainty to detectives that that night he had been following Samantha Bodsworth's Toyota Corolla wagon that evening. He wasn't able to confirm who had been driving or if there'd been a passenger in the vehicle. The detectives and investigators were sure that whoever was driving Sam's car that night had intentionally driven it back to the Gympie nightclub in the hopes that the investigation would revolve around Samantha's going to the club for a night out and meeting a stranger. The detectives needed to speak to anyone that may have seen Samantha on that Friday, anyone who may have witnessed Sam and Michael together, how they were acting, what they were saying, anything that might give them something to go on. Pauline Christian, who worked at the Mount Pleasant Hotel, was interviewed by the police. She told investigators that she had seen Michael and Sam at the hotel on the Friday afternoon. Michael had told police that they were just having a chat about the hot water system and Michael going over to Sam's to take a shower, but Pauline told detectives that they had been arguing about something, she didn't know what, but that they had argued almost every time they'd seen each other since Michael had moved into the hotel. She told police that if Sam was ever seen talking to a male at the hotel, Michael would have his fists up, ready to fight, or he would violently grab Sam's arm and tell her she shouldn't be talking to other guys. This made police question whether Michael really would have been fine with Sam seeing Scott Knowles, as he had said. Pauline confirmed that the hot water system was indeed broken, so it wouldn't have been unusual for him to have requested to shower at Sam's place. But there were a few things that had happened on the Saturday morning that she did find very strange. Michael had come up to her and told her that he wanted to do a basket of washing. Pauline knew that Sam had always done Michael's washing. Always. Michael had never once washed his own clothes in the months that he'd been staying at the hotel, so she found it very odd that on this day he wanted to do one small basket of washing himself. She also told detectives that when it was Michael's turn to look after the boys, Michael and Corey, that he almost never stayed at the hotel. He would take them out to the Big Pineapple or for a drive to the beach or out for the day. The pub and hotel weren't really the most appropriate place to have your 5- and 7-year-old children hanging around for the weekend. But the same day that he just decided to randomly do his own washing, he also brought the kids into the hotel and stayed there with them most of the day. He was asking anyone who entered if they'd seen Sam. He was asking the bartenders and the cleaning staff, "Where's Sam? Where's Sam?" Anyone who would make eye contact with him, he'd ask, had they seen her? That wasn't the only question he was asking, though. He had also been asking some of the hotel patrons if they could help him understand 24-hour time. He'd been asking what 1844 meant in 12-hour time. He'd been trying to find out what the timestamp was on the docket he had received when he bought the Long Beach smokes the night before. Now, he told police that he always checked the time on receipts because he didn't wear a watch, so that's how he told the time. But if that was the case, firstly, he'd probably be able to read 24-hour time by that point in life, and secondly, why would he be asking the day after he'd made the purchase? Detectives were becoming more and more suspicious of Michael with every person they spoke to. He was the last person to have seen or spoken to Samantha. He had her keys in his room. He'd walked all the way to and from her house the last night she'd been seen. He'd claimed he had a broken down car which seemed to magically fix itself. He did washing for the first time apparently in his life. He stayed at the hotel all day on Saturday, showing off his receipt from Woolworths from the night before. He had fresh cuts and scratch marks on his hands. He had memorized his exact movements on the night. But none of this was evidence that he'd committed a crime. He was either telling the truth and was completely innocent, and these just happened to be a number of coincidences, or he was a killer who was doing everything he could to get away with murder. Almost a week after Samantha had been found in Noosa, on Thursday the 5th of September 1996, a memorial was held at the Cooloola Coast Crematorium. More than 100 people attended, paying their respects to a loved member of their community, for a woman who would give you the shirt off her back even if it was her last one, who would do anything for anyone, and a woman who was brutally murdered. Lynn Hall, Samantha's mother, spoke at the service. "You were so happy," she said, "and now so tragically gone from us. But your love and our memory of you will be in our hearts, always." Samantha's family and friends, including Scott Knowles, were angry and frustrated that the investigation hadn't brought about the arrest of anyone for the murder of the beautiful young girl. They all thought it had been Michael, but as yet investigators did not have enough evidence to arrest and charge him. They were still waiting for pathology results from the fingernail scrapings, the blood at Sam's house, Michael's saliva, and the vegetation found in her car. They were still pleading with the local community for anyone to come forward who knew anything or might be able to help them in any way. A woman named Patricia Kelly eventually spoke up and said that she might be able to help them. Patricia was a tarot card reader and a clairvoyant, and don't worry, we're not going where you think we're going with this. Patricia had done readings frequently with both Samantha and Michael and had formed a close friendship with the both of them. She believed that if Michael had murdered Samantha, she thought that there was a chance that she might be able to get him to tell her the truth. The police arranged for Patricia to wear a wire, and then she arranged a meeting with Michael in a park in Gympie. She asked how Michael was doing, and he told her he was, getting there, just trying to stay out of the way of the lynch mob for a while. Patricia told Michael that she'd been having Sam come to her, that Sam had been talking to her, and that the only thing that Sam kept saying is, "Go and see Michael, go and see Michael." She told Michael that a few times she'd put out the cards, meaning tarot cards, and that they weren't good, and the cards didn't look good for him. Michael quickly responded by saying that nothing was looking good for him, like, what's new? And Patricia said that she knew that, but that Sam kept coming to her and kept pointing the finger at him. She told Michael that if he had killed Sam and he needed somebody to talk to, that he could talk to her and that she wouldn't judge him. But Michael maintained his story and was adamant about his innocence. She told him the problem was that he was under intense suspicion and they didn't really have any other suspects. Michael responded by saying that he'd given police everything that they'd asked for, apart from blood, but he had given them his saliva. He told Patricia that, well, of course he'd given his DNA, why wouldn't he? And it probably wouldn't matter anyway, because of course they were going to find his DNA at Samantha's house. I mean, he did used to live there. As this recording was being reviewed, the pathology results had come back. Michael Bodsworth's DNA was found on a tea towel in the kitchen of Samantha's home and on the floor of the bedroom. His DNA was also found on one of the 5 cigarette butts found in Samantha's bedroom, but not in any of the ones in the ashtray in her car. But his DNA was found one other place, underneath Samantha's fingernails. The investigators now had some physical evidence to prove that Michael and Samantha had had some sort of altercation that would be the cause of his blood or skin to be under her nails. But it wasn't enough. As Michael had told Patricia, he used to live in that house only a few months ago and he'd visited the home often, so of course his DNA was going to be there. And he also freely admitted to detectives that he and Sam had argued frequently, so it's conceivable that she would have his DNA underneath her fingernails. There was still no solid proof that Michael had committed any crime except for maybe being a bad husband. What the investigators really needed was a link that placed Michael not only at her house, but at the Noosa Parklands, the place that her body had been discovered. Michael had said to police in his interview that Samantha had never gone to Noosa that he knew of, and that they had definitely never gone there together, and that he'd not gone there either and wasn't there on the night of Friday the 30th. If they could prove that Michael had been at her home and at the place that her body had been dumped, then they would have what they needed to charge him with her murder. The only viable link that detectives could think of was the vegetation and the pollen that had been found in her car. It was consistent with the wattle trees that investigators had seen at the crime scene. The study of pollen in crime is called forensic palinology, and it had never before been used in any criminal case in Australia. In fact, at the time of this case, it had been used less than 10 times worldwide. Investigators knew that they needed to get every bit of physical and circumstantial evidence together because this branch of forensics had never been used before. They wanted it to be completely solid if it did end up linking Michael Bodsworth to the murder of Samantha. They spent the next few months combing through evidence, the crime scenes, the photos taken at both locations, collecting fibres, pollen samples, and sand samples from the vehicle. In the months since Michael's DNA had been found underneath Samantha's fingernails, Lynn and Malcolm Hall had been fighting a custody battle for Samantha's 2 young children. Lynn and Malcolm felt sure in their heads and their hearts that Michael had done this to their daughter, and now their priority was to keep their grandsons safe. They petitioned for full custody of Michael and Corey, and on the day of the ruling, full custody was awarded to Malcolm and Lynette Hall. Michael Bodsworth, having lost custody of his children and feeling like there was nothing left for him in Gympie, decided to move interstate. He packed up his life and he moved to Adelaide in South Australia. Malcolm and Lynn felt that now there was very little chance that he would ever face justice. They felt like the murder of their beloved daughter would go unsolved. But before Michael left, he had one last item of business to attend to. He had crafted a white wooden cross, inscribed with her date of birth, 23/12/67, on one arm, and the date she'd been found, 31/8/96, on the other. Down the middle, he had painted RIP, Love You Sam, and the initials M, M, C, DD, and GP, and under that the words All of Us. The first 3 letters, M, M, and C, stood for Michael, Michael, and Corey. It's unknown who DD and GP were, but they could have been friends of the couple or other family members. Michael had tied this cross to a tree in the Parklands where the body had been found, but he had placed it a fair distance off where she'd actually been found, indicating that he didn't know where the body had been dumped, in an attempt to further remove himself from suspicion. While the custody battle had been taking place and in the months after, the Queensland police got in touch with a Dr. Lynn Milne from the University of Western Australia. She was a doctor of palinology, which was the study of plant pollen, spores, and microscopic planktonic organisms living and in fossil forms. While Lynn was an expert in the field of pollen, she was not a forensic expert. There were none. This was the first time in the history of Australian crime that palinology was going to be used in a forensic sense. She knew that someone's life could hang in the balance of the results that she came to. She wasn't there to prove anyone's guilt or innocence. She was there to give evidence, and that evidence, she knew, would be used in court to determine guilt or innocence, and she was determined to be as thorough and specific as possible. What Dr. Milne needed to find out was if Michael Bodsworth and the pollen found in the car and license plate could be linked to the flowering plants that Samantha's body had been dumped in. The site where Samantha had been found had 2 different species of the acacia wattle, and Dr. Milne needed to be able to prove, firstly, that she could differentiate between the 2. She could, easily. One of the main reasons she fell in love with palinology in the first place is because each species of plant pollen was like a snowflake. No 2 were quite the same. She found the symmetry in the pollen fascinating, and the fact that every spore is different for every plant. One of the 2 species of wattle was Acacia sopherae. It's a bushy shrub-like plant, and Samantha's body had been found amongst a lot of it. She identified the same pollen on the driver's seat and the seat well of Samantha's car, and from the large pollen flower found lodged in the number plate. Dr. Lynn Milne was 100% certain of this, as that particular acacia is specifically animal or insect pollinating. This means that it doesn't just fly off in the wind, something needs to physically touch it or brush against it for it to transfer. This was proof that the car had indeed been driven to the site where Samantha's body had been found, and may even have been driven some way into the bushes, perhaps to assist the guilty party in transporting the body into the Parklands, out of sight of the car park itself. Dr. Milne said that if Bodsworth was the perpetrator, you would definitely expect to find some of this particular acacia pollen on his clothes or shoes. Now, the police still had Michael's clothing from the night Samantha disappeared in their possession, but before police had collected it and after Michael stated that he'd last seen Samantha, the clothes had been washed. Lynn Milne and the investigators had taken tape lifts from the clothing. If the clothes had not been washed and he had been to Noosa Parklands, he would have had hundreds of the microscopic spores from the acacia on his clothing, but they had been washed. But no cycle through a washing machine was enough to remove all of the fibres that clung to the fabric. Amongst the fibres was a small number of plant spores and pollen. They were a match to the acacia sopherae. For the first time in Australian forensic history, police and investigators had linked a suspect to a crime scene with forensic palinology. The detectives and investigators couldn't take any chances though before they were ready to make the arrest. They walked the route that Michael Bodsworth had said he'd walked that night to ensure that there were no flowering acacia, wattle trees or shrubs that he might have brushed up against. Well, Lynn Milne determined that the acacia plants found in Gympie were well off the path that Michael had walked and were actually not flowering at all at the time. But again, she wanted to be as specific and thorough as possible, as her evidence may send a man to jail. She requested samples of the flowering pollen from the Gympie species of acacia from the Queensland herbarium and examined them carefully. She compared the Gympie acacia species to the acacia sopherae found in Noosa. The spores and pollen were completely different. The pollen found on Michael's clothes could only have come from the Noosa plants. That was it. That was the information the detectives needed. By the time they had tracked down Michael Bodsworth, it had been 8 months since Samantha's body had been found beaten, bruised and strangled in the Noosa Parklands, an hour away from her home and family. The investigators and detectives had travelled to South Australia and had finally caught up with Michael Bodsworth at a fuel station 30 minutes out of Adelaide in Christie's Beach. On Wednesday, the 23rd of April 1997, Michael Bodsworth was officially charged with the murder of Samantha Bodsworth. Michael seemed surprised. He obviously thought that enough time had passed that he had gotten away with it, not knowing about this brand new field of forensics that was being developed and used behind the scenes to put a spanner in the works of his so-called perfect murder. On the journey back from South Australia to Queensland on that same day, Michael announced that he wanted to talk. He wanted to tell the truth and confess. They told him that they'd be happy to take his statement, but they needed to wait until they got back to a police station that had the proper recording equipment. When they arrived at the Maroochydore police station in Queensland, they set up an interrogation room and Michael began to speak. Michael revealed to officers that Samantha had actually picked him up from Woolworths the night she had died. He had said in the previous interview that Sam had rung him back, claiming to have locked herself out of the house, and had never come, so this was news to detectives. After Sam had picked him up, he said they had gone back to her house, as Michael was still planning to have a shower there. On the way back to her house, she had told Michael that he wasn't going to be able to have the kids for weekends anymore. Her dad, Malcolm, had witnessed Michael driving dangerously many times with both boys in the car and had told Samantha about it, and Samantha had decided that she didn't want her boys to be in danger, so she told Michael that he wasn't going to be able to take them anywhere anymore. Michael told detectives that his kids meant everything to him, and Samantha had basically just told him that he wasn't going to be able to see them anymore, so he just lost it. But, okay, if your kids mean everything to you, why drive around in a way that's going to endanger them? I don't know. Detectives asked Michael what he meant by he lost it, and Michael said, well, I ended up strangling her somehow. I can't remember much about it. Sidebar. You somehow ended up strangling her. No. No, Michael. That's a choice. There is a conscious decision you have to make. You don't just somehow end up strangling someone. He came out of his trance that just so happened to only cover the time of the strangling to find her dead, and he panicked. And instead of calling the police and letting someone know, he chose to try to cover up the murder. He noticed some marks on her top and he said to police that, she wouldn't go out with dirty clothes on, so I changed her. He carried Samantha's now dead body to the car, propped her up in the front seat, and he drove Samantha and the car an hour away to Noosa. He pulled into the Noosa Parklands car park, reversed into the bush, and dragged her out of the car. He left her body there, in the dark, got back into the car, and drove to Gympie. He parked her car in the back parking lot of the Gympie Night Disco and walked home. When asked why he'd left her car there, he said he wanted to make it look like she'd just gone for a night out. So it turns out that people that had reported that they may have seen a man and Samantha driving around that night were right. They had seen Michael Bodsworth driving Samantha's car with Samantha, very dead, in the passenger seat. Michael had put a baseball cap on her to hide her face and had driven her out of Gympie. To onlookers, it just seemed like the two were going on a nighttime drive, but it was something so much worse. Now, no one believed that Michael had essentially blacked out for the actual murder and awoken right afterwards to hide the crime. The police, through Michael's confession and the evidence at the scene, had an idea of what had happened. They suspected that Sam had left the Mount Pleasant Hotel after an argument with Michael and had gone home to get herself ready for a night out with Scott. Michael had told detectives that Sam had picked him up from the grocery store. Well, he'd eventually told them that, but Sam's parents are adamant that she would never leave the house without makeup on. He had also told them in his previous interview that he had walked to her place, and they thought that this might actually have been true. It's suspected that he arrived at her place on foot, leaving his car at the grocery store parking lot, creating another notch in his airtight alibi. He'd told police in his first interview that Sam had told him that she'd locked herself out of the house, so he said to her that she'd have to break back in somehow. This, again, was just a cover for the fact that Michael most likely had been the one to remove the screen from the window near the front door and had snuck into Samantha's home. The presumed version of events, based on Michael's confession and the evidence, is that he had broken into her home and found her fresh from a shower, dressed but before she'd put makeup on. She had been dressed in a white top and blue jeans to go and have a drink at the bar with Scott. She may have mentioned that he wasn't going to be able to see the kids when they'd argued at the hotel that night, and he'd been angry enough to head over to her house to plead his case and try and change her mind. He told detectives in his confession that they had a fight at her house that night about his dangerous driving with their children in the car, and she'd told him that after the coming weekend he wasn't going to be able to take them anymore. Michael did lose it, and he lashed out at Sam. The bruising on her body indicated that he had been violently physical with her during this altercation. The bruising around her neck showed that she'd had someone's hands around her throat, but the ligature marks clearly indicated that she'd also been strangled with a cord of some kind. Her windpipe was crushed when she was found, and it's alleged that Michael, after beating her and crushing her throat with his bare hands, then went to the bathroom, grabbed the hairdryer that Samantha had been using after her shower, which was found with Samantha's blood on it. Michael wrapped the cord around her throat and strangled Samantha Bodsworth to death. She'd obviously fought back and fought hard, and she had caused the scratch marks around his hands and fingers, perhaps trying to get him to let go of her neck. He'd then decided to stage the murder as someone who'd gone out to a club. He pulled off Samantha's clothes, breaking her necklace, and threw the clothes she was wearing in the wash with the pendant from the necklace caught in them. Faint bloodstains had been found on the clothes that were still wet in the washing machine, so clearly Michael was trying to hide evidence of any struggle or fight with her. He'd then redressed her in clothes that she might have worn to a nightclub instead of a bar. As he carried her body to the car, blood had dripped onto the floor. He had placed her in the vehicle after putting a hat on her head to hide her face, and went back to try and wipe up some of the blood, before getting into the driver's seat and driving Samantha to the Noosa Parklands, where she was found the next morning. After he drove the hour southeast and dumping Samantha's body in the Parklands, he then drove her car back to Gympie. He parked it in the parking lot of the nightclub, walked back to his car, and drove back to his hotel. This is the interpretation of the events that may have occurred, and the evidence that was found supported this theory. I'm not saying this is 100% how it happened or what happened, but that's what made sense. At Michael Bodsworth's hearing, even after confessing to Samantha's murder, he, of course, pleaded not guilty. At his trial, Dr. Lynn Milne gave the crucial palinological evidence that tied Michael to the murder, and he was convicted. The jury also didn't believe that Michael had not known what he was doing when he murdered the mother of his children, and he received a life sentence. Michael had tried to commit the perfect murder, and he'd almost gotten away with it. The evidence the detectives had was completely circumstantial, and none of it actually linked Michael to the crime. They didn't even have enough evidence to hold or arrest Michael for the murder until Australia's first ever forensic palinologist, Lynn Milne, stepped in. It was controversial. It had been used so little in the course of justice throughout the world and had been used never before in Australia. But it was the missing link. It was the evidence that police needed to put a killer behind bars. The pollen and spore evidence and Michael's confession worked hand in hand to convict him of murdering this beautiful, caring, loving young woman. Michael Bodsworth served 21 years in prison before being released on parole in 2019. He's somewhere out there right now. It's unknown where he lives now, or if he's using an alias, or if he ever tried to reconnect with his children. But it is known that he brutally murdered a young woman because he was angry, and that is a scary thought. Australia now has a full forensic palinology department, and palinology is helping to solve cold cases from around the world. Pollen is resistant to decomposition, so it's one bit of evidence that can be examined many, many years after a crime may have been committed. Now, Dr. Lynn Milne worked tirelessly without being paid to help solve this case, and she is now really close friends with Malcolm and Lynn Hall. When she travels to Queensland, she stays with the Halls, and she's also watched Samantha's sons, Michael and Corey, grow up. She says that the boys are two incredible young men, and Samantha would be very proud of them. So guys, that is the case of Samantha Bodsworth and the almost perfect murder. I do hope to see you on the next episode, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.